I've been interested in the Shepherd's Monument at Shugborough Hall in Staffordshire for over 40 years. When I made the first version of this film just over a year ago, I thought it contained everything there was to be said about the monument and its mysteries. But in January 2019, I stumbled across some new information which changed my understanding of the monument and also shed new light on the life of Thomas Anson, the landowner who had developed the estate of Shugborough in the 18th century. The new information will be explained at the end of the film. Thomas Anson, the older brother of Admiral George Anson, was born in 1695 and died in 1773. He was a rather mysterious character. Though he was trained as a lawyer, there's no sign he ever practised. He was a secretive patron of the arts. Very few documents, particularly of his early life, survive.
If you look at books published over the last 40 years, you'll find all kinds of dates given to the Shepherd's Monument, and even confusion of who designed it. There may be two architects involved. James Athenian Stewart, who built the classical monuments at Shugborough, and the interesting and eccentric Thomas Wright of Durham. Thomas Wright was a mathematician and cosmologist or astronomer, but he did architecture for his friends. He had worked for Lady Anson, Admiral Anson's wife's sister-in-law, in Bedfordshire before coming to Shugborough. Everything about Shugborough tends to be mysterious, and it's fairly typical of the mystery of Shugborough that Thomas Wright's name appears in no documents in the archives in Staffordshire Records Office, and Thomas Anson and Shugborough are mentioned nowhere in Thomas Wright's surviving notes. In fact, if you make a chronology of everything that's known about Thomas Wright, there's a complete blank for 1748, which is just the time when the work at Shugborough must have been done. There's no reason to doubt that Wright was the architect who laid out the grounds and built the original monuments at Shugborough. There are some features in the dining room and library which are similar to other works by him, but there's also a design for an arbour in a lavish book of designs of arbours and grottos that he published in the 1750s. This is very similar in design to the core of the Shepherd's Monument. Another arbour of the same shape appears in a sketch for a garden for badminton in Wiltshire. This garden is very eccentric indeed and has all kinds of esoteric features. There's a wood arranged in the form of a magic square of Jupiter. The simple explanation, if simple's the word, is that the Shepherd's Monument is the work of two architects. The inner core is an arbour, typical of a design by Thomas Wright, but that's surrounded by an arch and pediment designed by James Athenian Stewart, who designed the classical monuments at Shugborough. There are possibly slight indications in the stone that Wright's arbour was built on its own, and the outer arch was added later. But it might be that Wright simply drew a design that Stewart then added the outer arch to. This is the way Thomas Wright worked. He would do a drawing of the intended monument, but it might not be built for several years. At Shugborough, the gentleman architect Sanderson Miller certainly actually built some of the monuments, probably from Wright's designs, including the Cats Monument. And in Ireland, where Wright was in 1747, buildings from his designs were being actually constructed over the next 10 years. The reason why Stewart might have added to the design is that the Shepherd's Monument is actually there to support the marble relief by shoemakers based on Poussin's painting The Shepherds of Arcadia. This could easily have been commissioned in 1748, when I believe Wright was actually working at Shugborough, but it might not have been delivered for 4 or 5 years. It used to be assumed that James Stewart didn't start working at Shugborough till 1760, when the Doric Temple was built, but there's a code stone panel attached to the Cats Monument, which seems to be a spare left over from Stewart's interior designs for Wentworth Woodhouse in 1755, and there's no doubt that Stewart knew Thomas Anson and was at Hagley Park with him in 1758. There's a drawing by Stewart in the British Library of a rustic column which exactly matches the columns on the Shepherd's Monument. So it seems that Stewart will have designed that external arch to protect the very precious marble relief. The monument was certainly there in 1756. In that year, Elizabeth Anson, the Admiral's wife, was returning home to Cambridgeshire, to her family home at Wimpole, when she was stopped in Lichfield by Dr. Seward, who presented her with a poem written by his 13-year-old daughter Anna. As Lady Anson wrote in the letter which she sent to Thomas back at Shugborough enclosing the poem, this must indeed be greatly inferior to its subject. The poem by the young Anna, on an emblematical basso relievo after a famous picture of Nicholas Poussin, is a meditation on death and of no literary interest whatsoever. This is not the poem which is sometimes quoted as being by Anna Seward, which has the reference to the Shepherd's Monument and, as it says, the mystic ciphers which conceal her name, referring to the shepherdess. That's actually a quote from a long anonymous poem which describes the whole of the estate, and the manuscript of that poem is clearly dated 1767, so it has nothing whatsoever to do with Anna Seward. The style, which is an imitation of Milton's Paradise Lost, is very, very like the style of the poet Richard Jago, who was a friend of the architect Sanderson Miller, who worked at Shugborough, and who had only recently published a long poem called Edge Hill, describing the landscape in Warwickshire in a very similar style. In 1756, the monument probably looked exactly as it does today, with the Poussin relief, the inscription, Wright's Arbour, and the outer arch by Stewart. The Stewart Contribution is possibly the earliest surviving building by Stewart, and also the earliest surviving building of the Greek Revival, which is important in its own right. But why is there such a mystery about the involvement of Thomas Wright at Shugborough? As I've said, there are very few records of the private life of Thomas Anson, but there are a couple of extraordinary anecdotes preserved in books by his friends. One of them is in a book by Erasmus Darwin, published many years later, Zoonomia, which describes Thomas's failure to save the life of his friend Lord Scarborough. As Erasmus Darwin wrote, Mr. Anson, the brother to the late Lord Anson, related to me the following anecdote of the death of Lord S.C., who was Lord Scarborough. His lordship sent to see Mr. Anson on the Monday preceding his death and said, "You are the only friend I value in the world. I determined therefore to acquaint you that I am tired of the insipidity of life and intend tomorrow to leave it." Mr. Anson said, after much conversation, that he was obliged to leave town till Friday, and added, "As you profess a friendship for me, do me this last favour, I entreat you, live till I return." Lord Scarborough believed this to be a pious artifice to gain time, but nevertheless agreed, if he should return by 4 o'clock on that day. Mr. Anson did not return till 5, and perceived by the countenances of the domestics that the deed was done. This extraordinarily dramatic event happened in 1740. It was a notorious suicide, and it was even written about by Voltaire. It's hard to imagine what effect this would have had on Thomas Anson. Scarborough was a man with an obsessive sense of honour. If he said he was going to shoot himself at a certain time, he would. The point of this was that Lord Scarborough had been Thomas Wright's patron and had brought him to London from the north to help him start his career. Could it be that Thomas Anson took on the patronage of Wright because of his sense of guilt? There's no trace of what Thomas Wright was doing in 1748, apart from one reference in a letter by Elizabeth Carter, his close friend, mentioning that she met him in London, where he was telling her about his great theory of the universe. His book, An Original Theory of the Universe, was published in 1750, so this must have been written during that period. It's an extraordinarily lavish production, with very elaborate prints showing multiple universes. It also describes the Milky Way as our view through a galaxy, which was the first time anyone had suggested such a thing. So this lavish book must have been paid for by a wealthy patron. So I can only assume that this is what Thomas Anson was supporting, and that the designs for Shugborough were done as a gift. What we will never know is whether Thomas Wright knew that his arbour was going to be the place to display the relief of Poussin's Shepherds of Arcadia. It's most likely that the concept of the Shepherd's Monument comes from Elizabeth Anson, the Admiral's wife, and her brother-in-law Thomas. In 1747, the year before she married Admiral Anson, Elizabeth York had bought a pencil sketch, probably an original Poussin sketch, of the earlier version of the painting of the Shepherds of Arcadia. 3 years later, in August 1750, she wrote to her sister-in-law, Jemima Gray, at Rest Park, where Thomas Wright had lived as tutor a few years before this, that she was copying the Duke of Devonshire's picture. This was almost certainly the original of Poussin's first version of the Shepherds of Arcadia, which belonged to the Duke of Devonshire, and which after 1761 was at Chatsworth House, where it is today. In the portrait of Lady Anson by Hudson at Shugborough, she's holding a watercolour by herself of Dante. In the copy of this picture that used to hang at her family home, Wimpole Hall in Cambridgeshire, she's holding either the original Poussin drawing that she had bought, or her own copy of the Duke of Devonshire's painting. This image obviously had a great significance to Lady Anson, but what she imagined when she thought of the Shepherds of Arcadia was this earlier version by Poussin of the subject. Here, shepherds in the ideal world of Arcadia have discovered a tomb marked with the inscription Et in Arcadia ego, I too am in Arcady, and this reveals that death is present even in this ideal world. But this means that the Poussin that we see on the Shepherd's Monument is not the picture that was familiar to Lady Anson. How is it that that picture appears on the monument? The explanation is very down to earth, and it does suggest that there was no intention of having the famous Louvre version of Poussin's picture, which people have seen so many hidden meanings in. The simple fact is that the Chatsworth Poussin, the Duke of Devonshire's picture, was very little known at the time. A commission to shoemakers to make a relief based on the Shepherds of Arcadia would have sent him in search of a print of what he assumed was meant. Prints of the famous Poussin in the Louvre were generally in reverse. The artist would engrave a copper plate from the original picture, and when it was printed, it would be printed in mirror image. The monument was designed to hold a picture in what we think of as portrait shape, whereas Poussin's Louvre et in Arcadia Ego is what we think of as landscape shape. So Scheemakers had to redesign the image to fit into the space available. He also added an urn on top of the tomb, which in the original is square and box-like and would not really mean anything if shown simply in white marble. Though the Louvre version of the Shepherds of Arcadia has all kinds of significance and beauty that the original does not have, particularly in the figure of the shepherdess, who seems to be philosophically resigned to the idea of death and maybe teaches higher truths. There's no reason to suppose that there was any serious intention of having this image in the gardens at Shugborough. The monument was clearly a vanitas monument at a time when Stoicism was very popular. In fact, at this very time, the poet Elizabeth Carter, who was the closest friend of the architect Thomas Wright, was translating the works of Epictetus, and this became a surprise bestseller. The inscription on the Shepherd's Monument is designed to be a mystery and to make the monument an object of contemplation. I feel any explanation for those letters has to take into account what's known of the history of Shugborough and the ideas of the people who were involved with the place. The only explanation I've ever come across that fits all those conditions is that the letters are the initials of a Latin translation from the English Bible phrase, "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity." If that's translated into Latin, it comes to "Orator ut omnia sunt vanitas eit, vanitas vanitatem." But that's just one of many, many explanations that have been offered.
There is a surprising amount of evidence about the Shepherd's Monument, and curious hints that the imagery was important to its creators. Mysteries remain. Elizabeth York's interest in Poussin seems to go back to 1747, the year before she married George Anson. If the monument is a joint project of Lady Anson and her brother-in-law Thomas, when did their plan emerge? Could the monument, with the Poussin relief, have been there before Stewart's alterations, and before the earliest dated reference to it, that letter of 1756? In January 2019, I was looking through old papers and rewriting my book about Thomas Anson, which you'll find on my website. I found a photocopy of a poem which I had had for over 30 years. I might never have read it before. It's a poem, the original in Staffordshire Archives, by the Reverend Sneed Davis. The poet was a prebendary in Lichfield and later Archdeacon of Derby. It's clearly titled "To Thomas Anson Esquire of Shugborough," an old spelling of Shugborough. It begins: "After thy course of various travel run, and to his morning glories trace the sun, here, Anson, rest. The busy toil is o'er, and waves and tempests recommend the shore." This is a poem addressed to Thomas Anson, as an adventurous traveller returned to his home and safety. The poem mentions the exotic places Thomas had been to. He'd certainly been to Cairo in 1741. The poem implies he had been to Athens, but could he have been to Palmyra, the great ruined city in the Syrian desert? Yes, he could. He was in Aleppo for 3 weeks in 1741, just long enough to make the 5 days camel ride to the ruins, as Pocock had done a couple of years earlier. There's no reason to doubt the Reverend Sneed Davis. Thomas was more of an adventurer than we thought. When was the poem written? It's not dated, but there's a letter from Sneed Davis to the Bishop of Lichfield, dated Eccleshall, July the 30th, 1750. He was very enthusiastic about his visit to Shugborough. He mentions the ruins. A pile of broken arches and of imperfect pillars to counterfeit the remains of antiquity. The architect could not perform his part satisfactorily without finishing the whole. Then comes Mr. Anson with axes and chisels to demolish as much of it as taste and judgment claimed. The idea of ruined columns comes into the poem. Davis writes, "Columns expressive of the stroke of fate happily recall to thy attentive eye some loved remain of fair antiquity." The poem is probably from that same visit in July 1750, but it doesn't mention the Shepherd's Monument. But the longer, published version does. This is another of those extraordinary confusions, like the confusion of the 1756 poem and Anna Seward, which, as they say, dogs Shugborough. Sneed Davis's poem was published in 1816 after his death, but the editor, George Harding, somehow assumed it was a poem about Admiral Anson. In fact, it's the poem which is often quoted as being an elegy for George, and the longer published version does mention the Shepherd's Monument. It says, "Upon that storied marble cast thine eye, the scene commands a moralizing sigh, e'en in Arcadia's blessed Elysian plains," etc., etc. "Life's emblem here in youth and vernal bloom, but reason's finger pointing at the tomb." Yes, this is a poem about Thomas and his travels. It has nothing to do with George. We can't be sure, but there's no reason why the poem, in both versions, shouldn't date from 1750. As if the manuscript in the Record Office is a rough copy given to Thomas Anson on Sneed Davis's visit, and the published version is taken from a neat, revised, extended copy made when Davis got home. If this is the case, the Shepherd's Monument was there in 1750. It would have looked very like Thomas Wright's design for an arbour at Badminton, which was made the same year. If this is true, we can't be sure when Stewart made the additions. All we can say is that they could have been as early as 1756, but they might not be. The Sneed Davis poem pushes the monument back to the beginnings of the development of Shugborough. It brings it back to Thomas Wright and to its place as the key object of the landscape and the Greek revival.